Australia was one of the countries with a low figure of cases and deaths among the population, but from July 9th in the morning, Melbourne in Victoria entered its second lockdown that will last for 6 weeks. We're reading reports that the authorities are trying to put the blame on workers and individuals for that development. And today we will discuss all this with Kai from Melbourne. Kai is a member of Socialist Action, our sister organization in Australia. So hello, Kai, and thanks for being with us. First of all, how was the first phase of the quarantine lockdown developed in Australia? I mean, in which ways did it affect the different social groups and classes, if you want to make some points on that?
Yeah, so Australia avoided COVID compared to the rest of the world, but I would say only just avoided it. We went into lockdown on, I think it was 47-ish days after the first case in Australia. Quite infamously, our Prime Minister Scott Morrison actually waited till right after there was a large gathering of his church before he banned public gatherings. And initially, it really exposed a lot of fundamental problems in our system. Probably the most clear one was our welfare system. The day after, like the day lockdowns were announced, the welfare system was flooded. A lot of people had lost their jobs and had to line up, and it showed how completely inefficient the system was. And during a pandemic, people were forced to line up, not being able to socially distance in these incredibly long queues that wrapped around the buildings of the Centrelink, which is our welfare system. And it was actually impossible to actually even get on there because their systems crashed, even though they should have been preparing for, thousands and thousands of Australians to try and get onto that after losing their jobs, or, if they're like me and they were casual, just not receiving any more shifts. The government had to do a lot of backpedaling from that. So for about over 20 years, so pretty much my entire life, for over 20 years, I should say, they actually hadn't increased welfare. It used to be linked to inflation, and it was no longer linked to inflation. So in some ways, welfare had actually gone back. And they've been saying, we don't have money in the budget for this, and that, it's just not a priority. And this really just showed how much of a lie that was, because after that, there's a lot of outrage. They doubled it almost instantly, and it just showed that they clearly did have the money. They just didn't want to do it. But now it wasn't just, like the poorest of society who were being affected. It was a lot of, regular working people who were suddenly out of jobs, who had what would have been really stable jobs, especially in, for example, tourism and a lot of other industries. They still made it incredibly difficult to access. For example, a lot of young people living at home wouldn't have access to the welfare system. And they also created another form of welfare where basically they gave your employer money to keep you employed and to provide you with pay. But they made all these sort of arbitrary rules, like you had to be working in the company for a year and like a few other things that actually made it that a lot of people didn't receive that payment, but they also couldn't get access to the welfare payment. So basically there's still a lot of people, particularly young people, who don't have any access to that money and either having to rely on family or friends. And so that's probably I would say one of the biggest effects of that we saw with the first wave or the first lockdown was just an instant sort of exposure of how much our system doesn't actually work. And people who've never had to access welfare and things like that, actually seeing how difficult it actually is to get on it, like the hours you have to spend in lines, on a phone call, and to get nowhere.
Very important, I think. And what was the situation concerning the healthcare system? I mean, before the first wave, and what's the situation now that you're entering the second wave of lockdown?
I think that's a really good question. I think like most countries, our healthcare system is severely underfunded. And this is before COVID. We have a public healthcare system, but it's constantly being under attack by the government as well as big businesses. So every budget the government release every year, they always find a way to shift money away from healthcare and public healthcare and put it into private hands, whether it be through tax cuts for the rich, or a lot of other various and nefarious ways that they do this. For example, they're constantly attacking NDIS, which is basically the disability service here. There's constant attacks on LGBTIQ healthcare, mental health services, aged healthcare, and there's obviously a huge issue with privatization. When the government does invest the money, it typically goes to private companies. For example, investments into aged healthcare go to the private, for example, private care homes for elderly people. There's also a huge issue with access to it. There's a huge demand, obviously, for a lot of healthcare, but there'll be waiting lists for years just to go to a public dentist, for example. And if you've got a dental, like a dental issue, and it's not treated for years, that can turn into a more serious health issue that can affect things like your liver and so on. And that, I think, also has been quite exposed by the system. A lot of people who also work as nurses, while we haven't seen the worst of it that we've seen in places like America, where they've had doctors and nurses with garbage bags as protective personal equipment, there's definitely been a real stress on the system. Not enough information is provided to healthcare workers, as well as not enough support in like physical support, in the sense where they need more people working. They need to be paid appropriately, but also not like actual support with getting patients who either have COVID or are completely unrelated to COVID, but are also experiencing emergencies. They'll still have to wait and things like that. And I think there's a lot of anecdotal examples of that, where people have tried to go to the hospital and basically been denied services essentially, or had to wait for hours to basically be told they can't do anything for them because they're currently overrun. And that's just gotten worse with COVID. And I think as well with this new surge in Melbourne, it's definitely going to get a lot worse.
Okay, so which events led to the second lockdown of Melbourne? I mean, what were the reasons? Was it necessary? Could it have been avoided, perhaps? And what is the working class reaction on that?
Yeah, so I think the biggest cause is probably just forcing people to go back to work. As the lockdowns were lifting, people were starting to having to go back to work, but works weren't necessarily providing actual ways to protect their workers. They weren't providing masks, they weren't providing hand sanitizer. Shops had you could only have X amount of people in this store, but they didn't have any way of enforcing that. They didn't have, extra people working so that they can count the amount of people coming in, or some shops did, but not all did. And I think that played a role in just increasing the amount of people going out, as well as that. It also probably, when you're forced to go back to work, during a pandemic, especially if it's a non-essential job, it kind of feels redundant. It's like, why do I have to, why is it okay for me to go and sell, plants or whatever they're selling, but I can't see my friends? And so as those lockdowns the restrictions lessen, I think it just felt really redundant. If it's okay to go back to work, why then it should be okay for me to spend time with an intimate group of people. And I think that definitely played a role in it. It just made people feel like, well, the government seemed to be fine. Everything seems like the government don't seem to be that worried anymore. So it must be getting better. I think I can take these risks, which is an understandable reaction. I think it would be normal, especially if you haven't seen, your loved ones for months, essentially. I think that played a big role in it. I think also just the biggest thing is probably that there was just not enough information for a lot of people. It wasn't clear what they needed to do. I think that's the same everywhere. It's there's not specific rules about masks. There's not specific things that need to be people are aware of when it comes to hand sanitizer and things like that. So that definitely played a role in it. And I think a clear example of the fact that it's not safe is you'll have these shops that are opening up, but their head offices will still be closed because, it's not safe. And it's why is it safe for someone to sell something on a shop floor, but it's not safe for you to work in the office? And it just, it really shows that these companies don't actually care about the safety of their employees, but they want to continue making money during a pandemic. I think that's probably the biggest thing And as well, I think there's been, I guess I would say, a mixed response of working people when it comes to, you know, this new wave. There's definitely this idea that we should blame, you know, individuals for going to parties or things like that, when in reality, a lot of people are probably getting it from work, who are getting it from, you know, not, even though they're trying to do the right thing, they still can catch it, because it's, you know, it's not possible to completely socially distance if you're forced to still go to work, forced to catch public transport and things like that. Like they have people cleaning things like public entities, like cleaning transport, but those people aren't really being provided with PPE. They're not always wearing gloves. They're not provided with masks all the time. You know, and so how can they really be properly, and they're not trained either. Then how can they be really, how can they properly disinfect things if they're not trained properly? There's a lot of, I guess you could call it almost like theatrical cleanliness. Like there's like, oh, we've got people scanning your temperatures before you enter the shops. They're not qualified. We haven't calibrated the, you know, these digital thermometers. They don't know what they're doing. They're pushing this thing and they're going, okay, well, it's not this number. Okay, like that's not enough to like actually be safe. And I think that that's played a huge role, and that theatrical sort of thing has made it so that people think that we're safe and then realizing that we're not safe, I think has been the biggest thing. There's also been a huge demonization, I would say, of poorer people. In particular, the most clear example is just before lockdown, we had 9 public housing estates that were put onto a hard lockdown without any warning. They're basically treated like prisoners. They were literally locked up in their building and couldn't leave. People wanted to just go to their car to get their inhaler because they have asthma, and there were police surrounding and said that they couldn't. You know, people couldn't visit their loved ones in hospital. They couldn't go to work. And there was just a lot of things. They were promised like these, you know, no rent. And there's been all these like this backtracking basically. There was a huge public anger at this, and, you know, communities instantly organized to help them, because even though the government is pushing that, it's, you know, it's poor people going out and not caring about COVID that's causing this. I think a lot of people could see that wasn't true, and, you know, people organizing, getting food to residents, and, you know, other essentials. And when they did bring those essentials to people, they actually were taken away and not actually given to the residents in a lot of cases. So even when we've tried to, you know, community organize and things like that, the police have stepped in and basically stopped that. Which is like, this community organization wouldn't have had to happen if the government had been doing their job right the first time.
Okay, and one final question. What are the proposals or the program that Socialist Action is putting forward this period in Australia concerning the coronavirus? And
yeah, I think there's a few things that we would demand. Firstly, would obviously be healthcare for all. So that means an end to privatization of our healthcare system, increased investment into public health, increased pay for healthcare workers, as well as, you know, access to education for people who want to become healthcare workers, and anything in that regards as well. And that access to that, you know, healthcare should be free and actually accessible. You know, you shouldn't have to drive hours or go onto years-long waiting lists to just get your teeth checked. We also say that everyone should have access to either work or a livable income. So if they can't, so that their workplaces should be providing them with extra sick leave. For coronavirus, they shouldn't have to take out of their own sick leave if they do get sick. There should be actual, if they can't work, if their employers can't pay them, they should be given a livable income. You know, the amount that they're given now is on welfare is an increase, but it's only temporary. We think that increase should also stay, and it should continue to increase. That increase should be linked to inflation. We say that it should be it should be linked to inflation. There should also be free education and care for everyone who needs it. That is vital and important, obviously, as you know, we're heading back to school. Kids should still have access to education, but that needs to be done in a safe way that's safe for both teachers and the students and their families, whether that means to continue doing online education, that is an option, and that should be done in a way where it's actually useful for the children, and there should be support for parents as well. We also think that there should be safety for housing, so people should have safe and secure housing. So there should be things like rent freeze and mortgage freezes. So basically you don't have to pay rent or mortgage during these months. And that, you know, anyone who is experiencing hardship in that regard should obviously receive support, which isn't what's happening now. And that's a huge issue. If you can't work and you're not being provided with any financial assistance, then how can you afford rent? But also if your financial assistance is going purely to rent, then it's not really helping the people who need it. You know, they still have to buy basic necessities like food and bills and other things like that. And we think as well, though, democracy and our rights shouldn't be under attack under the guise of COVID. So there shouldn't be things like banning protest and demonstrations like that. They should not be banned under this guise, because that's something that the government have been trying to weasel their way into being able to stop, basically, is, you know, people using their rights and having access to their democracy. And we do think that these things, you have to fight against this system of capitalism to actually achieve these changes. They're all linked to capitalism and they're systemic issues. And we think that the only way you can do it is actually by an organized collective fight back of working class people. And we also think that we have to look at changing this system, and this system of capitalism has to change. And, you know, we're a socialist organization. We believe that socialism is the way forward, and it has to be fought for. You know, these sort of things aren't going to be won. We weren't given increases to welfare because the government suddenly decided they care about, you know, working people. They just realized that if they didn't, that they could be dealing with a huge amount of public anger, that like even more than they were already dealing with. And, you know, that's what forced their hand. It's not the kindness of big businesses. It's not the kindness of the government. It's always because people fought for it. And it's important that we remember that, and that we continue to, we keep on continuing to fight.
Thank you very much, Kai, for the interview and solidarity.
Awesome. No, thank you very much. And solidarity to you in Greece as well.